Hey guys, what's going on? We're back with another Destiny 2 video, and today we're doing a dungeon tier list. I may do a raid tier list in the future, but for today I just wanted to focus on dungeons because, well, I think dungeons are some of the coolest content in the game. If you only have 3 people, it's a great way to just kick back, relax, have some fun, and, Master exists, so if you're looking for more of a challenge, there you go. We're going to go in chronological order, starting with Shattered Throne, and then making our way up to the most recent dungeon, which released in Season of the Wish, Warlords Ruin. So without further ado, let's get into the categories, the criteria that I have for grading these dungeons. The number 1 category is replayability. Most dungeons you're going to end up doing maybe 15 to 20 times depending on the time you have and the loot, which is also another category. And replayability is a huge part of that. Are the mechanics fun to do? Are they glitchy? Are the bosses hard or easy to do? Does it take forever to get to damage like it does with some bosses? Yeah, that's right, I'm talking to you, Samuma. Or is it relatively easy? And let's just be clear, I think easy mechanics and complicated are a little bit different. If it's complicated, doesn't mean it's not hard, it might just take a while, it's a whole thing. But mechanics, generally speaking, you want stuff that's quick in a dungeon, stuff that feels good. There are some dungeons, like Duality, where the bells can be a little glitchy or weird, and you end up dead somehow, or something like that. But replayability is huge, because like a raid, there might be guns you want, you might have to grind for pinnacles, the armor might be cool, you might want to get artifice. Questions that we're going to answer in this is which dungeons are the most replayable, and that's definitely going to be a factor. The loot definitely plays into that, although I keep the loot separate simply for the fact that each different dungeon has, maybe 1 or 2 good guns, but the armor might be cool, like in Ghost of the Deep, so you might just do it for the armor. Whereas a dungeon like Warlords Ruin has really only 1 good gun, the armor's okay, the exotic's not great, but it is a fun dungeon to do. And the mechanics are different, and the story is definitely fun as well. Speaking of story, that is our 3rd and final category. Is the story gripping? Is it engaging? Is it cool from a lore perspective? Or is it boring and there's absolutely no flavor text or exposition, and you're just like, I'm here to shoot some bad dudes and go home and get some guns, like true Destiny style. Destiny does have really good lore, it's just really, generally speaking, a question of whether or not the story team, the narrative team, did a good job explaining everything. We certainly have had that in the past with The Witness and Lightfall, and the lack of exposition and what the bloody hell is going on. He's just here, what is he? But now we know. It only took, an extra season to figure out. But anyways, I'm going on a tangent. Shattered Throne replayability is, well, I have to say it's gotten power crept to all hell, and this is part of the reason why I didn't really want to rank these older dungeons, but I kind of just have to throw them in anyways because there's not a lot of dungeons to start with. But it's a really easy dungeon to do now. Even if you're new to the game, you're going to just breeze through everything. You just have to learn the mechanics, and the mechanics are relatively easy to learn. So the problem is the loot. It's old, it hasn't been redone. It would be really cool if there were, specific guns to Shattered Throne, but they're just the Dreaming City weapons that you can get from Season of the Wish, and they have better perks on them because they were redone for this season. So, generally speaking, Shattered Throne and its loot and replayability just doesn't compete with newer dungeons because, again, the power creep is real, it's just so easy to complete. And the story, it's kind of cool, it's very one-note because the Dreaming City is just all about Throne Worlds and Ascendant Planes and the Taken and the Awoken. So, what I like about the recent seasons is that the dungeons have taken a bit of a twist on what's going on in the story, or at least they've had some really cool events in the story tied to them. So again, it just pulls you in with that, and you're like, wow, okay, this is interesting. Orcs is dead in Titan, or underneath Titan's Methane Sea. You're like, that's freaking amazing. This is what we've been asking for, is where the heck did Oryx's body go? And we figure it out in the story. There's nothing quite like that in Shattered Throne, but it was cool when it first came out. But again, it does kind of suffer from the passage of time, similar to how Vault of Glass has done the same. Vault of Glass is a nostalgia trip for some people, but aside from that, you know, it's really just plain in its mechanics. I mean, literally one of the encounters is a public event, so like, obviously the newer raids, there might be a little recency bias, but to be completely honest, the newer raids are better, with maybe the exception of Ron, but Vow was a fantastic raid. And you know, it's one of my favorite raids out there. I mean, everything that I mentioned for criteria, Vow hits on. So you can imagine where I'd put it on the tier list. So that means we're going to start Shattered Throne. It's going to be D tier. And D does not mean dungeon. Trust me, D is just, it's okay. Like, I don't really go out of my way to play this dungeon at all. And neither should you, in my opinion. Okay, so next we're on to Pit of Heresy. Which, listen, I'm a sucker for the Hive. I love Hive anything, so I'm going to be a little biased here. The replayability, again, it does suffer from power creep because it is a very old dungeon. Excuse me, so, again, the mechanics are somewhat simple. The bosses fall over, like, you just have to sneeze on them, basically. But, you know, that can be fun, you know, it can be. With Shattered Throne, obviously it takes away, and I think with Pit of Heresy, the challenge factor isn't there. You're not going to get that like you do with some of the more recent ones, again, for simply the fact that they're power crept into oblivion. So yeah, the loot, again, most of it is old, it's outdated. If Bungie went back and redid this like they are doing with Prophecy, then again, you might get more people to play it, and I think that's definitely something they'll do down the line, but for right now, the loot just isn't there. So the story is cool because it's very Hivey. It's a lot of siblings killing each other, and essentially Zolmak gets killed and by a weaker being, but is eventually remade via the wishes of Savathun, and that's the final boss that we face, and they're very much trying to become the next Crota or Oryx and following the path of Nokris in a sense. So again, the Hive are undoubtedly one of the coolest story-driven species, and you know, we haven't really gotten too much on the Vex, but we know that we're going to get that in the future. The Scorn have been front and center for a while, the Fallen have had their ups and downs, and the Cabal have obviously been ever present. But yeah, definitely the Vex have been the ones that have been most neglected in the narrative, but now, right now, the Hive are again omnipresent, because of Savathun and Xivu Arath's existence and presence in the story, although Xivu obviously isn't quite as present anymore after Eris Morn nerfed her into the ground. But yeah, Savathun is out there and probably up to something, but she's kind of on our side, at least for now. But yeah, the story is definitely the best part of this dungeon. Loot is okay, not great. Actually, it's horrible. What am I saying? The replayability, I think there's a fun factor to it in some senses. It definitely is a cooler dungeon in like an obstacle course sense, but again, it's just not entirely there. So that means we're going to put Pit in the C tier. It's just a slight step ahead of the Shattered Throne. If I could, I would put it maybe somewhere in between C and D tier. But, you know, I like it, so I'm going to leave it in the C tier. So that brings us up to Prophecy. Now, this one is in a weird place because, again, Prophecy is getting a weapons update very soon. Now, I've seen some of the weapons, but we don't really know how they're going to play out. I will say that some of the guns are okay in the current meta. They're nothing great. So the loot is something that can change in the future. So again, don't take this to heart. If the new weapons are out and they're really good, then you can obviously move this up a tier or two, because listen, this is one of the best dungeons out there. And you're probably like, what? Yes, it has been power crept a little bit, but Rainbow Road is just such a cool thing, and I hope it's something they do more of. The skybox is beautiful. If I had to score a dungeon on pure looks, Prophecy would be S tier. That's where it would be. And that's what Destiny is about. It's about looking cool. It's about having cool music that's awesome to listen to, and having sick loot. But again, the loot, obviously being the way it is, does take this dungeon down a tier or two. And the story is cool in a sense. You know, the 9 are trying to help us out, and we get a preview of Aramis, and really the 9's realm is just such a cool place, and I hope it's something we visit more often, and maybe something in the future. The 9 should be more included in the story because we don't know much about them from a lore perspective, but again, we'll have to wait and see. So again, you can really change the rating on this if the weapons are good, if they're worthwhile. But for now, I'm gonna leave it in B tier. And I know each one's been increasing incrementally. Trust me, it's gonna change in a minute here. But again, I think the loot does really take it down a notch. There isn't really any gun that I think is worthwhile getting from Prophecy. I could be wrong. Again, this is all subjective. Maybe you love Prophecy and you love a certain weapon from it, but I think it looks cool, it sounds cool, the environment is great, the story is okay, but aside from that, it's not the best dungeon, obviously. Next up, we have Grasp of Avarice, which is a fun dungeon in some senses. The replayability can get lost in a couple scenarios. I do enjoy encounters that you can speed up, and the Fallen Shield encounter is one that you just simply cannot. Although I will say the other two encounters, the Ogre and the Boss, are relatively easy and you can speed them up in various ways. So yeah, the replayability is cool, I will say, in that sense. Again, Fallen Shield is just a bit of an annoying encounter, having to jump from platform to platform to kill the servitors, and you always have to kill 5, I think it is, or 4 or 5, somewhere in there, which, you know, is okay. It's alright. As for loot, it's a lot of old D1 guns, and when it first came out, Matador was the shotgun to get. It's not the greatest anymore, but it's still upper echelon for PvP. As long as you get that 5 of 5 threat detector opening shot, it's really nice. Luna, another really nice hand cannon, stasis that you can get from Grasp of Avarice. It's solid. It's really solid. And 1,000-yard stare, I've yet to get a good roll on that. It was one of my favorite D1 snipers, but no dice. So yeah. Armor is not half bad either, and of course Gallowhorn was tied to it. So respectively, I think I have to put this one in A tier. Okay, so this next one is definitely one of my favorites, and the replayability is a little wonky. I talked about earlier how the bell mechanics for duality can be weird, and I remember day 1, it killed me a lot. I remember solo flawless, I died once to the bells for no reason. I was in the circle, I swear to God, but the game said, no, you dead. I think the story is gripping. We're essentially cutting off the memories of Callus from himself, and this is what in turn helps him to become a disciple. And if we hadn't done this, he may not have met the unceremonious end that he had in Lightfall. And to be honest, I kind of wish that didn't happen because he was such an influential character in the story, and he got his comeuppance really, again, unceremoniously. But the mechanics are really okay. I think I can look past it because, again, the story is so good. The loot is okay. The SMG is one of the best PvE void SMGs out there. The stasis pulse is like, it's not great, but it's not bad. Storm Chaser, when it first came out, was really good. So obviously, it's not as good as anymore it's not as good anymore. There are some other 3-burst fusions out there that are better, like maybe Fire and Forget is a little bit better. I think the new Void one from Season of the Wish is a 3-tap, but again, Taipan exists. To be completely honest, anything that's from a dungeon and isn't craftable, unless it's like really specific to the dungeon and it's the only way you can get a certain role, then it's not good, right? but there is a couple of exceptions in Duality for some decent guns. It's not great loot, but it's not bad. It's definitely in the middle. And again, story's great. So obviously we're gonna continue the trend. We've gone from D to C to B tier, and that means Duality goes into the A tier. I think that the mechanics can be a little glitchy, and you know, it does kind of mess up your play style a little bit here and there. Not really your play style, but your feng shui, if you will, your mojo. So I think they've fixed most of the issues, and it is slightly power crept because Keitel again kind of just falls over. Like, come on. A tier is a good place for it, just because I think if the loot was better, it definitely would be an S tier, because the story is S tier, the replayability is about an A tier, but the loot is probably somewhere around a C to a B tier maybe. Again, it's subjective, but I think A is a good place to put it. So that brings us to our more recent dungeons and Spire of the Watcher. Now, this one, mechanics, talking about repetitive. Listen, if you're gonna do this dungeon, it does do a good job of introducing you to the Arc Node's mechanic while keeping it throughout the entire dungeon and mixing it up here and there, but not too much. I do think it is very monotonous in terms of the mechanic, and the bosses are a little, well, okay. When they first came out, they were very, very bullet spongy. And this is something that I just hate with dungeons, because one of the incentives with a dungeon is for people to solo flawless, for people to duo the dungeons if they want to kind of increase that challenge for fun. And when you have a dungeon boss who has more health than certain raid bosses, that's a red flag. And it's definitely something that is a cause for concern, and they certainly looked at that with more recent dungeons, and they were like, okay, there's ways we can, or well, really it was just Warlords Ruin, but there's ways that we can make it easier for players to get high damage without sacrificing huge chunks of phases. I remember solo flawless probably took me 7 or 8 phases, and it was just not good. Granted, I was running a hunter, and I think if you ran a solar warlock with demo and Starfire Protocol, which was meta at the time, it was actually pretty easy. But I like doing all my solo flawlesses on Hunter, because not many people do it on Hunter, because it's usually considered one of the harder ones, but there's a couple builds out there that make it pretty easy to solo flawless just about anything in the game. But yeah, the bosses being the way they were just definitely made solo flawless much more of a pain than it should ever be. And not that solo flawless should be the only factor for a dungeon, but yeah. The loot is also just, it's ass. It's poopy dog water. It's nowhere near as good as any other dungeon, and it really does knock Spire of the Watcher down a couple of pegs, because again, you're not going to replay a dungeon if the loot isn't good. Like, you're just not. That's a simple fact. And the story is cool. Cisteria, the AI that was trying to warn us about the Witness. There's some cool lore behind Cisteria and her involvement with the Ishtar Collective and the Vex and all that jazz. So the story does give it a slight bump, but not by much. So this is going to leave Spire of the Watcher at C tier with Pit of Heresy. Yes, I don't like Spire of the Watcher that much. I think it was fun when it first came out, but man, it just hasn't aged well for me. It is power crept a little bit, so the bosses aren't quite as bad as they used to be, but thinking back on those solo flawless runs and how long it took, man, it just wasn't fun. And even doing runs early on, the boss is very tanky and he does a lot of damage, but he doesn't take a lot of damage, so deaths were it's not a good dungeon, in my opinion. Okay. So excuse the potential recency bias with these next two dungeons, but I do really like Ghost of the Deep and Warlords Ruin. So this is going to be really hard for me to see which one's better. This is why I'm happy I'm doing a tier list and not like a top 3 list or top 5, because I mean, there's so many good things about Ghost of the Deep. There are some bad things, but anyways, let's get into it. So replayability is something it's really iffy on Ghost. I do think that this is probably one of the most unique dungeons out there, with the water mechanic in there as well, because you have to traverse water, and not many dungeons have something like that. Well, not water, it's methane, excuse me. But it is cool. Not that that's really a mechanic. I mean, it's kind of a mechanic, but anyways, the first boss, Ekthar, is definitely one of my favorite bosses in all of these dungeons, because it has such a high ad density. It's such a small area, and stuff like Liar's Handshake really shines in there. If you're solo flawlessing, it is so fantastic to use that. And Legend of Acreus, you could use that. Legend of Acreus and Star Eaters. It's fantastic. It's so great. Even when I'm playing with friends, and let's say I'm playing with my boyfriend who just loves to clear ads, he will, he has enough ads to clear and I have enough ads to clear, and, we're not fighting over ads, which is something that happens a lot in older content because ad density just wasn't an issue, but, now it is, and clearly in Ghosts of the Deep, we were listened to. Maybe a little bit too much in some cases, but, beggars can't be choosers, right? So there's that. I definitely love Ekthar as a boss. Now, Samuma. Samuma is a different story. Man, so different. It takes too long to get to damage. She's very, very tanky. I think the one redeeming factor in Samuma is I can't really find one, honestly. It takes forever, and the mini bosses that you have to kill to get to damage are difficult, and I think that's good. I do like having difficulty. I usually kill the hunter when I'm doing the dungeon, but I have obviously when I solo flawless, I had to do the Titan, Hive Guardian, and the Warlock, which is Void and Storm Trance respectively, or some Void and Arc. Okay, you get the picture. So again, Samuma is a boss that just suffers from, it takes long to get to damage, it takes long to kill her, at least initially. Again, been power crept a little bit, so a solid 2 phase is usually what you would expect, but sometimes it can be a 3 or 4 phase depending on what you're using. And solo flawless, man alive, have fun with that because it just sucks. And I was lucky because I cheated a little bit. Maybe you can understand my pain because I had to go through Spire, but I cheated, not like illegitimately. It was during the crafting, so I was using the crafted weapons, like a cataclysmic with an aggressive frame, which hits like a truck. Amit aggressive frame. So yes, the survivability was still an issue for me. In fact, I think I died on Ekthar my first run through. But once I realized the power of these weapons, it was such a breeze, and it's how it should have been. If I was doing a true solo flawless run, it should be that easy to do damage anyways, because you're not always gonna live. You're gonna make a silly mistake. You're gonna forget a mechanic, or you're gonna get overwhelmed with ads. I'm not saying you should always have these powerful weapons, but you should have at least the ability to do a crap ton of damage. Or it should maybe scale down the health based on whether or not you're running solo, duo, trio, whatever. Now the loot is okay. Really only 2 guns that I think I would chase at any point in time. Cold Comfort is most likely the best legendary non-crafted rocket you can get. It's definitely up there. Envious Bait and Switch allows for really top heavy damage, but if you're doing a damage phase where it's really quick, it's fantastic. And the SMG, I don't know what it's called, but it can get some decent perks on it for PvE and PvP. So, it's okay. I think there are better SMGs out there. But hey, if you get it, you could like it. And of course, last but not least, the story. The story for Ghosts of the Deep is fantastic. They were trying to bring back the Taken King, because the Lucent Hive are so desperate to bring some kind of leader to fruition, because they have no one. Savathun was dead. You know, her ghost is being held captive at the moment. Zevrorath will not lead Heretic Hive into battle. That's just not her way. And so on, you know? Who knows if Orcs even would have done it. He might have just, you know, unalived himself once the Lucent Hive were like, hey, we want you to be our head honcho. And he's like, nah, I didn't die for this. See you in the Throne World, or not the Throne World, I guess the Hive Afterlife. So we're gonna put Ghost of the Deep in S tier, actually. I think the environment for it, I love the environment, the water, or methane. I keep saying water. It looks like water, it sounds like water, but it's methane because it's heavy, more dense, whatever. The guns are okay. Again, nothing is super good except Cold Comfort, so nothing chaseable. The armor, I didn't mention the armor. The armor is fantastic. It shades really well, it's cool, and it's really desirable. And not to mention that the exotic, the Navigator, does have some niche uses here and there. Again, it isn't great, but if you're using a Strand melee Titan build, it can come in handy. So all that together, I think the replayability is probably somewhere around a B tier. The loot, probably in the same boat, but the story helps it a lot. And I just think the fun factor, the environment, does help to elevate everything else in the mix there, at least in my opinion. And last, but certainly not least, is Warlord's Ruin. I think that this is the best dungeon replayability-wise, because the bosses are super duper simple, and there's easy ways to work around them to get increased damage. The first boss is a cakewalk, getting one phase by some people in solo flawless. And the second boss, the Ogre, can get a little hairy here and there, but generally speaking, you're looking at a solid 2 phase no matter what. The final boss is probably difficult on solo flawless. I haven't gotten there yet because I'm just taking my time with everything this season. But yeah, it can get pretty bad, pretty chaotic. Although it might be easier with one person because I think that only spawns one of these Scorn Wraiths who have the debuff that you have to give them. So, you know, it's less Scorn people trying to give you the taint or hepatitis B, if you will, which is nice. You know, I don't want hepatitis B, especially taking hepatitis B. Anyways, the loot is, again, it suffers tremendously from the fact that there's only one good gun, and it's the special sidearm. It's okay with Volt Shot, and I think Beacon Rounds is what you're supposed to get. I've been so unlucky with drops for this sidearm. I have not gotten Volt Shot once. I want to try it, but I can't because it's just not dropping for me. Aside from that, I've heard the bow is okay. The sword is a Strand caster frame, and then the sniper is like not great. It sounds cool and it looks cool, but the perks are just, they're not there. It's trash. Aside from that, you know, the exotic, the Buried Bloodline is okay. You know, it might work well with a Void build, but again, no one really uses Void this season, so who cares? It might be good down the line. So yeah, the story is cool in the sense that this Ahamkara was asked to take revenge for its owner and, well, not its owner, but the person who asked for the wish. And it's cool to know that there are other Ahamkara out there that made these wishes and that they can exist like this. And also there's a pufferfish. It looks like a pufferfish, okay? I know it's like the spirit of the Ahamkara or whatever. I haven't really studied that much up on the story, so excuse me. But I think just for the replayability, I like the aesthetic of this dungeon, so it's gonna go in the A tier. And again, there might be a little recency bias. I might look back on this and decide to change it, maybe to a B tier or a C tier. But it's a really solid dungeon, and I just like doing it, to be completely honest. And there's nothing wrong with that. Anyways, let me know what your guys' tier list would be, or what you would change with mine. Definitely some things that are up for debate here and there, but this is, again, my opinion. You can, of course, leave yours in the comment down below respectfully. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. Helps me out a lot. It's free, it's easy, it's simple, but as always, know that you just being here and watching these videos is plenty for me. See you in the next one.